Hi, everybody. We're starting up again. We've got a distinguished panel. But before that, we are really lucky and honored to have the Chancellor at the University of California at Berkeley, Robert Birgeneau. Bob is an extraordinary leader, and we have been very lucky to have him during these difficult times. He combines two things. He's a superb scholar, has had a distinguished career in physics and materials science, working in very interesting areas of research, and also a distinguished career as an educator. He's a physicist, as I said. He's been at MIT, where he was in, and this is always the test to find out if somebody's really been at MIT. If they say they were in physics, you know they're lying, because what he was in was course 8, right? And in building 4. So, oh, you were in 13? I thought the physics department was in 4. Okay, well, but the point is, what happens at MIT is a number dies that has a lot of money, then it gives money to MIT and they name a building after that number. So 13, for example, was a very distinguished number, died, gave money to MIT, and so on. And same thing with the courses, you know, course 8, you know, same idea. So when I was there, I was in 14 and 17. So anyway, so he was distinguished, he was the dean of the School of Science there. He was, I'm not going to make it long, don't worry. He's got numerous awards as an educator for his distinguished service. He was president of the University of Toronto. He's our chancellor here now. And really, our motto at the Goldman School is speaking truth to power. That's what Bob Birgeneau does. And if you listen to his statements in a whole variety of areas, to the regions, to the state legislature, to Silicon Valley, he has recently spoken truth to power time and time again. And that's really wonderful for the University of California, and I'm honored to have him here today. So, Bob.
Well, thank you so much. Actually, one fallout from speaking the truth is if you Google my name, you will see at least more than 100,000 hate mails. Because people do not like the truth, let me tell you, even in California, right? So it's certainly been interesting. I set the world record with my comments on the Arizona shootings, which I thought were right on, and even Rush Limbaugh condemned me on national. So I thought that was, you know, I'd sort of reached a level I never thought I would reach. And I'm going to make one correction, which is I would like to think I am having a career in physics. Thank you. That's how I intend to spend my entire weekend, actually, it happens. So I mean, I can only do physics on the weekend because it's sort of become a hobby. But right. Anyway, of course, it's my great honor to be here to celebrate the Goldman School of Public Policy's 40th anniversary. So it was, in effect, actually, from the notes I learned some things which I sort of knew but didn't know precisely before. So I learned specifically that in 1970-71, that academic year, that the Goldman School of Public Policy, what was the name then?
It was actually the School of Public Affairs, and then it became the School of Policy Analysis, and I'm not sure when this happened. It finally became the School of Public Policy.
And then when did it become Goldman School?
Goldman would have been around in the 90s.
In the 90s, yeah, okay. Okay. So the school, with its multiple labels, instituted one of the first modern public policy curricula, emphasizing economics, statistics, operations research, politics, law, and program implementation, which, you know, really, I think it's a sort of marvelous cross-section. And this is the 40th anniversary of that achievement. And since that time, almost all policy schools in our country have adopted GSSP's pioneering curriculum. And of course, I don't have to tell anybody here, the Goldman School continues to be a leader in the field of public policy, and it is generally ranked as the top public policy program in the country. And as a former longtime denizen of Cambridge, Massachusetts, I take particular pleasure in being able to say that for reasons that are probably obvious. The school has a diverse and exciting community of faculty who are committed to the highest standards of research, intellectual rigor, and engagement in contemporary public policy issues. The school's renowned faculty members are drawn from numerous disciplines such as economics, political science, law, social psychology, demography, architecture, physics. I think you just stuck that in, Henry, and engineering. And the school prides itself on its interdisciplinary approach to teaching and research. Actually, I know the physicist presumably is Dan Cameron. Dan Cameron. Right, got it. Okay. Who declined to join my group as a research student, I must say. And I assured him he would fail miserably because of that, but it didn't work out that way. The school has significant strengths and in many areas, including energy and environment. It's true that Dan Cameron declined to join my research group after I offered him a position. It's a whole separate. Social welfare programs, criminal justice and corrections, education and the welfare of children, defense policy and unconventional warfare, politics and public policy, and applying psychological principles to public policy. I think we all know that the Obama administration, and previous administrations too for that matter, has tapped the expertise of many Goldman School faculty members. Former Dean Michael Nocht served as Assistant Secretary for Global Strategic Affairs, where he focused on nuclear strategy and cyber warfare. Jesse Rothstein was Chief Economist at the Department of Labor before returning to GSPP. The Obama administration also has turned to John Quigley for advice on housing, David Kerp on education, Robert Reich, I was about to say on everything, but specifically on labor, at least he writes on everything, on labor and the economy, Dan Cameron on energy and environment, and Rucker Johnson on employment and labor force issues. By the way, Dan Cameron's actually a good friend of mine, so and I meet him regularly in airports. And Rob McCoon has been a major contributor to the debate on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where thank goodness we finally made some progress on that front. GSPP, the Alumni multiply the school's impact, as evidenced by the panel. And if we consider just a short list of alumni with careers of high-level public leadership, Ann Veneman, former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture and the head of UNICEF, Dorothy Robine, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Installations and Environment, U.S. Department of Defense, Mike Genest, person I got to know really well recently, who's the former director of California's Department of Finance, Carmen Chu, San Francisco supervisor, Nani Coloretti, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Management and Budget in the U.S. Department of Treasury, or at least was, Toby Douglas, who's been recently appointed as Director of the California Department of Healthcare Services, and all of our distinguished panelists. So these are just a few examples of the kinds of work and impact our graduates are having in the world. And if you ever wanted any evidence for the importance of universities, including the Goldman School, just watch television and see where the entire nation is coming to for advice on the Japan situation. So it's Berkeley faculty member after Berkeley faculty member, and we still are the center of expertise in so many important things. Of course, I also particularly want to recognize one individual who very sadly is no longer with us, who first of all has been obviously extraordinarily important to the Berkeley School of Public Policy, namely Richard Goldman, who I also over the last 6 years had the privilege of becoming a very close friend with and vacationed with him a couple times up in Tahoe. The Goldmans, led by Richard, have contributed generously to their alma mater, most notably a transformative $10 million gift to the School of Public Policy in 1997, so that's the date, followed by an additional $5.4 million, which has doubled the number of students in the learning space and also has greatly enhanced programs and public outreach. And today, the Richard and Rhoda Goldman School of Public Policy has risen in national rankings to become the #1 graduate school in the nation in public policy analysis. And of course, we're honored to carry on Richard Goldman and indeed the entire Goldman family's legacy. Finally, of course, we've also been privileged at the Goldman School to have had great leadership, beginning with the founding dean, Aaron Wildowski, and leading to our current dean, Henry Brady, both presidents, I guess past presidents now, of the American Political Science Association and both members of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Clearly, the school will continue to evolve and grow now and in the future as public policy itself evolves and grows. And we on the Berkeley campus look forward to the extraordinary impacts that our faculty, alumni, and students will continue to have on the world. And changing public policy for the better in California, the nation, and the world is one of the preeminent tasks of the 21st century. And the Goldman School is and will continue to be a leader in this endeavor. So I want to thank all of you. And I'm now going to apologize to the panelists. I remember when I was a regular faculty member, I used to hate senior administrators who would come in and then leave before all the interesting stuff happens. But I'm actually meeting with the undergraduate students, their consortium on energy and the environment at 2:30. So, sorry, it's legit.
Thank you, Chancellor, for that very inspiring welcome to our group, and welcome to everybody.
Let me just introduce Lee Friedman, though, as all of you know, is a member of our faculty and a distinguished researcher on microeconomics in general, but specifically in the area of energy research, cap and trade, and smart grids right now. You're doing a lot of work with Citrus, right, as well. Great.
Thank you, Henry. Well, today we have, this afternoon, we have I think, a fantastic panel for you. I'm not going to go into detail about what each of these panelists have done in the area of climate change policy in terms of actually having achieved things, but I will say that I am in awe of the power of the people sitting at this table with me. That if I had to pick 4 people who had done the most about getting actual policies for climate change implemented anywhere, I think these 4 people would be it. And they just happen to be GSPP graduates. And they just happen to have had my microeconomics class. Anyway, let me introduce them briefly, and also tell you a little bit about how we've structured the panel. Each of these people they've done many things, and I've asked them to pick one thing, either that they've already done or that they are doing or that they're thinking about doing, and tell us about it and describe it and sort of the challenges that they've faced, and in the area of climate change policy. And then to think a little bit, for some of them having to go back quite a long time, to their education at GSPP, and kind of think about the tools that they needed in this event, in this action that they're describing to us, and what were the strengths and weaknesses that they see of the training that they had at GSPP that helped them or didn't help them, or were, were the pros and cons of their training in facing that problem. So, so you will get to hear a little bit about what I think is one, maybe the single most important public policy problem that I have ever confronted or know about. It's something, recessions are terrible, disasters like in Japan, unbelievably terrible, and world catastrophe that might happen or might not happen, but we might not be here after so many years, is even more terrible. And the fact that we have to act long before that happens to prevent it, it makes it an extremely challenging problem. And the fact that it's a global public good, the fact that no one of us, no one entity, no one government acting on its own can solve the problem, but everybody has to do it. I do not know of another problem like that the world has confronted. And so it isn't going to hurt anybody to learn a little bit more about it, and especially not from the people who are here in this panel. So let me introduce them very briefly. Reed Harvey is probably in the cushiest, least controversial position of anyone here. He's only the the acting director of the U.S. EPA Climate Change Division, which certain members of Congress are threatening to do away with altogether. He's going to talk to us about EPA's analysis of climate change legislation and what goes on in that in their shop when they do that. Carl Hausker is the vice president of ICF International. He has had important positions at EPA, at a nonprofit organization that worked internationally. He's been working also in this climate change area for more than 20 years. He's going to talk about applying and misapplying the benefit-cost analysis paradigm that you all remember, of course, to climate change. That is very controversial to try to apply standard principles of benefit-cost analysis in this area, and he's going to explain something about why that's so. Ned Helm is the president and founder of the Center for Clean Air Policy. And Ned is a facilitator par excellence. He has also been involved internationally in the development of the clean development mechanism that developing countries have used to participate in reducing greenhouse gases. In national legislation, or SO2, and for coal strip mines, in many, many areas of the environment over his career. And he's going to speak to us and tell us about developing a nationally appropriate mitigation action for the cement industry in Mexico. And I know that's exactly why all of you are here today. And last but certainly not least is Chuck Schulach, who is right now an independent consultant, but until very recently and for most of his career, he was employed at the California Air Resources Board, and he was the director of the climate change program responsible for the implementation of AB 32 in California, which is the nation's major cap-and-trade program to reduce climate change emissions. It's in California, but it will be the model for eventual national action. And Chuck is going to talk to us about the role of the electric drive in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from passenger vehicles. So each of these is a very focused story about whether an analytic tool or a particular thing, but boy, when these guys do these things, do they add up to to real achievements. So please join me in welcoming them to this panel. And we'll begin with Reed Harvey.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking Henry and Lee and Cecile in particular for inviting me here and being with you. I'm really impressed by this venue. You know, for the 2 years that I lived here in the 80s, I was unaware of this place, and it's really a real gift to be here and learn about it. I wanted to start on a personal note to say that this is an important anniversary, not just for GSPP, but also for my wife and I. We're one of many GSPP couples, and so this marks our 25th year. We were married up at the Episcopal Church near the Claremont in 1986, so we're particularly pleased to be back here this year. You know, I came out here. I was weighing several schools, and I got on the phone and I talked to Arnold Meltzner, and what he said sort of convinced me to come out. He just said, "No other place has the Chinese restaurants that we do," and that was thing one that convinced me, who's born and raised in the East Coast, and then also just the small class size. And so for me, that's been a huge difference in terms of bonding with people while I was here and just improving my education overall. So let me turn to my talk. So we have 15 minutes apiece? Okay. So I'm just going to speak, not show you slides. I'm going to first kind of talk briefly about EPA's kind of part in this climate policy problem, give you a little bit of a chronology of our involvement in the cap and trade legislation that moved through the House and the Senate in the 2008-2010 period, try to draw a few lessons learned from that, and then move more to the GSPP-centric sort of what did I sort of take from my GSPP education into that process. I'm not sure that I have concrete advice about what GSPP can do better. For one thing, I haven't really stayed up to speed with the curriculum changes, so I'm sure that you've solved all those problems. So let me start with some background. As Lee said, this is a very tough problem, and the reason why we're working on it is because we're concerned about the impacts of climate change, not only in the U.S. but on the world. And if you're familiar with the science, which I'm not going to spend much time on, there have been extensive studies by the National Academy of Sciences, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and other international bodies looking both at the impacts on the U.S. and in other countries. And what they say is that the impacts that we've already seen are likely to dramatically increase as we go forward in this century if we allow climate change and greenhouse gas emissions to continue unchecked. And the sort of impacts that you might see in the U.S. would be things like more sustained droughts, increased heat stress on livestock, more frequent and intense spring flooding, and more frequent and intense forest wildfires. And certainly for California, that last one is a problem. So, you know, there are real environmental and human health reasons to be concerned about this. And it's a challenge because of the global scope of the problem. The U.S. is contributing to this, China's contributing to this, and it's one of those problems where the costs to avert the problem are going to be felt today, and the benefits are going to accrue over a long period of time. So you have these intergenerational discounting issues that we've all learned about that make these sort of problems really intractable. Let me speak briefly to my specific role in this. So I'm in EPA's Office of Air and Radiation, and we have a couple other EPA folks in the audience here who are part of the climate change effort, both nationally and in California. Within the Air Office, we have a group that's focused on large-scale regional problems. So we have my group, the Climate Change Division. It's about 85 people or so. It's kind of the largest single group of people who work full-time on climate change within the federal government. We also have people who work on chlorofluorocarbons, which we are controlling under the Montreal Protocol, and that's about 30 people or so. We have people who work on controlling acid rain and other sort of regional problems. And we were, as Ned, sort of alluded, or Lee alluded to Ned's involvement originally, our group is the group that's implementing the cap and trade program for power plants that control SO2 and NOx around the country, and it's been very successful since it was authorized back in 1990. So we kind of bring to this the experience not only with climate change, but also with these market-based mechanisms. And so that gave us a particularly strong role to help write the market-based mechanisms parts of the Kyoto Protocol. My office was involved in that. We worked, as did Ned, with the European Union in helping them design and sort of get launched their emissions trading program. And we've obviously sort of brought forward the acid rain lesson. So what I'm going to focus on now is sort of what we've been doing in the 2008 to 2010 period. So we worked a lot with Congress. As some of you may know, the House and Senate both considered during that period legislation that would develop sort of a comprehensive approach to climate change through this cap and trade mechanism. And my office provided a lot of technical assistance as well as economic analysis, and I'll kind of walk you through the chronology on that. That failed in the summer of 2010, and so what we've been doing since then has been more regulatory. You probably know that the Supreme Court said in 2007 that EPA needs to act under the Clean Air Act to address this. We were sued to do that. And so at the same time that we were working on the legislative front, we had an effort underway to respond to the Supreme Court to address emissions from vehicles. We published those rules, and it was a collaborative effort with California, which Chuck will probably talk more about. And we announced in December efforts to go to issue rules later this year on power plants and also on refiners. And so if you look at the scope of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, the largest source is emissions from power plants. So we have a plan for that. Second largest source is transportation, and we've already issued those rules. And the third largest stationary source is refiners, and we have a plan for that. So we're making headway in terms of focusing on the biggest sources. We also have statutory authority under the Clean Air Act to issue permits under the Clean Air Act. And by virtue of the fact that we've done these vehicle rules last year, we are now in the process of starting to issue a greenhouse gas permit as part of our normal permitting process under the Clean Air Act. And we also, for the first time this year, are going to be collecting emissions data from specific facilities that we never have before. The Clean Air Act in 1990 gave us authority to collect CO2 data just from power plants, but we didn't really know what the emissions were from refiners or other large sources. But because of action that Congress authorized in 2008, we're now starting to get that information from the rest of the large emitters, so that's a good thing. So our approach to this has been to try to make the legislation happen. That hasn't worked. We have an obligation to do the regulatory work. As Lee alluded to, there's an effort in Congress to stop us from doing that, and we'll kind of see how that plays out. Just briefly, we have a large team of economists, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic analysis we did. We did a wide range of things to help Congress with the design of the program, to understand what are called the allocations, to understand the trade effects, to look at the effects on particular sectors like the agriculture sector and so on. We did science work for them, and we did a lot of legal work to help them with drafting. And so here, I'm going to go through the timeline real quickly. Spring of 2009, the House Energy and Commerce Committee started work on this. This is led by Congressman Waxman and also Congressman Markey, who heads a related committee. So they put together a bill, and we had been doing analyses for them to understand the cost of this, and it culminated with what's called a committee markup in May. And it was really fascinating for me. I was able to go up with about 10 other people at EPA, and we were sort of sequestered in the council's office in the committee room. And so every day we'd show up about 9 o'clock, and we'd be there till midnight. And it was really a fascinating chance for me firsthand to kind of see how a markup worked. And so you would see all the congressmen sort of caucusing and pulling together these attempts to kind of work through the issues in the bill. And we, as the analysts, were sitting in the back room with cell phones and laptops and responding to technical questions, running models, sort of doing a quick analysis. And so I think what it illustrated for me as sort of a policy analyst in the bureaucracy was the need to kind of be there and to be providing timely information. Because if we hadn't physically been there and we hadn't sort of had the resources with cell phones and email to reach folks, we wouldn't have really been of service. So that was just sort of being there and being in the process was critical. That bill passed that committee in May. It was a fairly partisan vote, and it passed the House at the end of June. But later that summer, the opposition really arose, and this is the same time there was opposition to the health care reform legislation that was moving forward, and there were also larger concerns about the economy. So we started to see kind of a pushback. And we at EPA and also the Congressional Budget Office and the Department of Energy, Congressional Research Service, all did analyses looking at the costs of this. And one thing that I learned from that was, as analysts, we were sort of focused on welfare effects, on consumption effects, and we were using general equilibrium models, fairly complex models. We were trying to do our best to kind of explain analyses to lawyers and politicians, but it's not easy. And I think sometimes they judged the efficacy of a policy by its effect on jobs. And for us as analysts, jobs was not really the metric that we were focused on. Our models, like we were using full employment models that were running out 50 years or longer. And so in our models, because they're by definition full employment models, jobs were not an output. But what we discovered as we were going through this process is that we weren't generating the numbers that the politicians actually cared the most about. And so I think we found kind of a disconnect between the metrics that the decision makers were worried about and the metrics that the analysts thought that we ought to focus on. As economists, we thought, net consumption effects and were really the true measure. But that didn't really jive with what the decision makers wanted. So in the fall of 2009, the Senate acted. Senator Kerry and Boxer introduced the bill in September. We did a very quick analysis by mid-October. And one of the lessons learned there was sometimes the decision-making process, the analytic process, don't keep up with each other. I'm sure Liz is nodding because, we kept saying we need 6 weeks, we need 6 weeks, and they gave us 2 weeks. And we were stuck. We couldn't run the models. And so we did something for them in 2 weeks. We sort of, by analogy, kind of inferred what the bill would cost based on our previous analyses. But it was very challenging for us to be in that position because we were not able to satisfy everyone's demand for this extensive analysis that we had done for the House because they didn't give us 6 weeks. And there was a lot of pressure, as Ned may recall, in the fall of 2009 because there were these international negotiations going on in Copenhagen to have the Senate act. And so the Senate was rushing to act, and they pushed through a bill, again, very partisan. There was a Republican boycott, as I recall, in the committee vote, and the whole thing kind of started to tank from then on. There was an effort in the spring of 2010 to have Senator Kerry, Senator Lieberman, Senator Graham kind of start from scratch and rebuild, but it never coalesced and it got caught up in larger debates about immigration reform and it kind of just spun out of control. And so by June of last year, it was pretty much dead. And then there was an election. This became an election issue, and that I think put the nail in the coffin. So we're not in a good place right now. The debate in Congress, as Lee said, is really not about this policy. It's about taking away the authority that the Supreme Court said we should exercise. So I'm going to wrap up just by talking about sort of the GSPP type skills that I kind of brought to this personally. I think Arnold's advice about being a policy analyst in the bureaucracy was always helpful for me to kind of be able to bridge the geeky economist speak to the political people, and that sometimes is a challenge. I think Gene Bardak's lessons in the Eightfold Path I always sort of kept in mind as a way to think about these challenges. So a lot of it was just sort of giving me a framework for thinking thoughtfully about this stuff. The classes that you and Fritzie Riesner taught me were really critical. I didn't learn about general equilibrium models in your class, and I wish I had, but I was really able to apply a lot of the thinking that you taught me, so I appreciate that. And I think the last thing that I always remember is Gene Bardak sort of story about you have to be able to talk to a cabbie. Like, you got to do the 5-minute talk to a cabbie about what this problem is and how to solve it. So that was really useful. When I'd go up to the Hill, I would sort of say, I'd sort of prepare my cabbie talk. And so I think that would be something that I would also say was valuable. So I'll stop there and try to keep us on schedule.
Okay, thanks very much, Reed. I meant to say in my introduction, by the way, that after you've heard the 4 stories, I'll open up the floor to you and we'll become a conversation, and whatever's on your mind you can ask any of us. And I'll just also interject very quickly. Henry mentioned earlier today that former Governor Granholm is a rock star on the stage. I heard her talk on green jobs, and she mentioned many policies that I completely support because of its climate change implications. But in every single case, my reason for supporting the policies has to do with a market failure that I can perceive and a reason why these policies are a solution to that market failure. In every single case, as far as I could tell, for Governor Granholm, the reason for supporting the policy is jobs. Jobs, jobs, jobs. So the reasoning is totally different, and it doesn't always go the same way, and we need to think about that issue. Let me turn the floor over to Carl Hausker, who's going to talk about a benefit cost issue.
Thank you, Lee. Let me echo the thanks that Reed expressed. I think Reed has a better memory than I do because I can only remember the fourfold path, but I think he internalized the full eightfold path. And I'm actually going to talk about the fourfold path, so one of these days I might expand my memory. I also can't help noticing that the climate change world is at one level kind of small and incestuous, even though we're working on this huge sprawling problem. As I look at my three colleagues here, I say, okay, let's see, ICF has supported EPA with its consulting work. We've supported Center for Clean Air Policy with consulting work. We've supported the CARB with cap and trade modeling, and so this is really just feels like getting together with old friends and old clients. My talk, as Lee said, is about the application and misapplication of benefit cost analysis to this issue of climate change. And putting my cards on the table at the front, I do believe that the benefit cost framework can be extremely useful for a variety of problems. It can throw light on problems, it can help make decisions, but in my view, you also need to know the limits. When does a problem not fit through that meat grinder? What are the boundaries we have to put around it? And if we do, what do we turn to instead? And the thrust of my remarks is that climate change is the poster child issue of something that cannot fit in that framework. I'm standing because I do have 3 slides I'm going to point to. I'm not going to impose death by PowerPoint on you. It's just 3. It's not 30 or 300, I promise. I want to start out by setting some context for this by noting that there is a huge chasm out there between what I call the climate policy community and various players in the political process who are completely denying the science of climate change. And I don't know, Reed, did you touch on ClimateGate in terms of your chronology? It's one key thing that made his job even worse, as many of you probably remember. In December of 2009, a bunch of emails were hacked and leaked to the press, and various media outlets and provocateurs spun this up into a big story and attempt to cast doubt on the growing, firming science of climate change. That is a huge problem, and those opposing any serious action on this problem no longer just talk about, well, the science is uncertain, we can't act yet. The talking point is now the science is a fraud. That's going to be a huge obstacle to overcome in the years ahead. What I'm going to focus on is also a huge chasm of a different nature. It's much more lower profile. It doesn't make the newspapers, but it's an important one. And that's between the climate policy community, which I define as scientists, policy wonks, some economists, other thinkers and actors in this arena, who are both basically saying we need to move quickly to start reducing emissions. We need to try to keep the overall warming of the planet less than or equal to about 2 degrees centigrade. And we advocate this position by using a risk management framework. There are just too many scary and often unknown risks beyond 2 degrees. Let's keep it underneath that. You could also perhaps invoke the dreaded precautionary principle, which economists don't like very much, but is talked about more in European circles, that you do need to take cautionary action before sort of driving the car off of a cliff. Opposed to this is what I would call a large group of mainstream economists. Not all economists, but I would say certainly the overwhelming majority of economists who accept the science of climate change. Yes, the planet is warming. Yes, human-made greenhouse gas emissions are responsible for much of that warming, but they base their policy advice on the benefit-cost analysis paradigm. And they conclude that don't move too fast to reduce emissions, don't incur major costs. Major costs simply aren't justified yet in terms of the benefits that we would reap. This is a major disconnect between the climate science, the climate policy community, and the mainstream economics community. And it's not getting the headlines right now. It may not seem that important given the kind of gridlock that we've entered into on U.S. policy, as Reed described, but it's important because I believe that when the science, when more and more people become convinced of the science, and sort of that argument is knocked down, we're going to come back to, well, we have to take action. Well, how much, how fast? And there are going to be decision makers who will embrace the position advocated by the mainstream economists that, well, let's take a look at the benefits and costs and not move too quickly. So let me quickly describe how the climate policy community reached its position, which then kind of feeds into how the economists reached their position. As many of you probably know, the last ice age ended about 20,000 years ago. Agriculture and civilization as we know it emerged beginning about 10,000 years ago, and it's had a pretty good run so far. And during that period, global temperatures have fluctuated a little bit, maybe just plus or minus about half a degree centigrade. And that's reflected also in the famous hockey stick chart, which doesn't go back a full 10,000 years, but has been extrapolated backwards from the current time to 1,000, even 2,000 years into the past through various proxy data, showing a fairly stable temperature on the vertical axis there. And then we're starting to see the increases in temperature in the last 100 years. So you can see we're about 0.6 degrees centigrade above a zero average of roughly the last 200 years, and climbing where we think by the end of this decade we could be, end of this century, we could be 2, 3, 4 degrees centigrade above average. We're not sure exactly how high, but that's where science tells us we're going. And by the way, this is the infamous hockey stick chart that people have been attacking for years, those who would deny the science, particularly denied it as part of ClimateGate. This has been reviewed by the National Academy of Sciences. This has been confirmed by recent research, by more proxy data just in the last couple of years, firming up this is what's happening, and we're moving away from stable temperatures into very unknown territory. What does science tell us about the impacts that could come from that? I'm not expecting you to read the small print on this chart, but to simply take a look at the major categories of impacts on water systems, water availability, ecosystems, food and agriculture, impacts on coasts from sea level rise, impacts on human health from growing temperatures, and just get a sense on the top, on the x-axis here, we have temperatures from 0 to 5 degrees centigrade. And this is a compiled chart by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, that compiles and reaches toward consensus on science, impacts, and solutions. And what the chart sort of illustrates is we do start feeling some impacts in the 0 to 2 degrees centigrade range, but new ones begin and accelerate and grow beyond 2 degrees centigrade. And that has led scientists and policy people to say, let's try to keep this under 2 degrees. And they also get some sense of the costs. They look at the costs of reducing emissions and think that for perhaps a few tenths of a % of GDP or less, we could get on a path to staying less than 2 degrees. They're also concerned about some effects that do not appear on this chart, which summarized evidence as of 2007. Since then, the issue of ocean acidification has come to the fore, and how ocean food chains could collapse as species at the bottom of the food chain collapse due to more acidic oceans. We have a more pessimistic view of agricultural impacts than was summarized in 2007, thanks to the work of people like Michael Hanneman at GSPP. And we also, the 2007 summary did not attempt to really drive to consensus on the risk of rapid sea level rise from the collapse of ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland. So the research in the last couple of years has made the outlook look even more risky. So the bottom line here is that the climate policy community is saying we need to manage these risks by aiming to keep warming to about less than 2 degrees. That's probably going to take reductions of maybe 20% of emissions by 2020, reductions on the order of 80% by 2050. The exact path isn't certain, and if you reduce more later, you can maybe emit more now. But it's a rough, and it takes into account in a qualitative way the costs. They know we can't go to zero emissions starting tomorrow. So, how do mainstream economists look at the same science and head in a very different direction? They look at the same chart. They believe the basic underlying physical, biological impact projections, but they apply a benefit cost framework where they're trying to determine the optimal amount of reductions in greenhouse gases. They want to find that point where the marginal benefit of reducing emissions just equals the marginal cost of reducing those emissions. And by the way, they disagree with some of the IPCC work on the cost side, but I'm going to focus on the benefit side today. What they do to estimate benefits is apply something called integrated assessment models to estimate the social cost of carbon, a figure measured in dollars per ton that would represent the extra cost we incur when we emit an extra ton of carbon dioxide. So they take a look at these same impacts. These models try to project out 200 years or even more on how those impacts would accumulate over time. They monetize the damages in terms of a marginal ton of carbon, and through the miracle of discounting, they take the present value of those monetized damages. And voila, you now have a marginal benefit number in dollars per ton that you can compare to, say, the marginal cost of reducing emissions through light bulbs or vehicles or something like that. So their thrust is maximize the net benefits of your actions by equating marginal benefits, marginal costs. Do this through a carbon tax or set a cap and trade system that would result in a market clearing price, you know, roughly at that social cost of carbon. Kind of sounds like policy 101. Perhaps attractive on the surface. Let me talk for a minute about these integrated assessment models. They range from fairly crude to very complex. There's 3 that are used widely, and they all rely on a lot of Monte Carlo simulation of what the social cost of carbon might be, of course, because there's tremendous uncertainties over all the variables across these different sectors, across the globe, across temperature paths. So you literally run thousands of Monte Carlo simulations. When the IPCC summarized the economic literature on this, in 2007, they said there's a big range of estimates on what this magic number might be. They average about $12 a ton. The estimates of the SEC range from negative $3 a ton up to as high as $95 a ton. The Obama administration actually convened an interagency work group, 2009 to 2010, that also tried to estimate what is this number. They came up with a central value of about $21 a ton, but also put forth a range of maybe as low as $6 a ton to $30, maybe even $65 a ton, sort of worst case catastrophic scenario. But for those of you who have some feel for what it costs to reduce CO2 or other greenhouse gas emissions, $12 a ton, $21 a ton doesn't justify too much action. Energy efficiency makes sense even at a low value. Maybe you could switch from coal plants to natural gas for $21 a ton. But if you're talking about serious decarbonization of the economy, new nuclear plants, coal capture with sequestration, major renewable energy options that we have out there, you're not going to move very fast at $12 or $21 a ton. And to sort of further illustrate what's going on here, I have a chart up here from the interagency report estimating the social cost of carbon. On the y-axis, you have the loss in GDP. It's in 0.01. That represents a 1% loss of GDP, 2, 3, 4% GDP. And on the horizontal axis, you have the temperature increase in degrees centigrade above the average of the last roughly 200 years. Interestingly, one of these models, one of the peer-reviewed, widely accepted models, shows a gain to GDP globally, these are global numbers, out to 3 degrees centigrade. When I first saw this, my jaw hit the floor. You have world leaders at conventions starting to coalesce around a goal of 2 degrees centigrade as you don't want to go beyond that range. And you have one of the key models in the world estimating that we have net benefits out to 3 degrees centigrade. I would say, if this is true, we should be subsidizing CO2 emissions. Let's get those benefits. Let's crank out more CO2. You'll also notice that 2 of the other models show relatively small damages out to 1 or 2 degrees C, only equal to about 1% of GDP averaged over the large future time period. So what the Obama administration group did was average these 3 models and came up with a central value of about $21 a ton as this touchstone value of what it's worth to reduce carbon today. This is, like I said, there's a very sharp contrast to how climate policy people think about this, what scientists are recommended to do. But there's a real attitude difference here, and I'm going to read a full quote because I think it really captures the chasm here and the attitude certainly on the side of the mainstream economists. At a workshop last year, a well-respected economist said, first and foremost, the problem that the IPCC has with economics is that it does not like the answers. It disagrees with the results of economic analysis. What are the results it doesn't like? When economists go to measure the damages of climate change, they are not finding them to be as large as the climate scientists believe they are. So when you actually go to measure these damages, they're not that large. That's very upsetting. What is also true is that when they go to measure the costs of trying to stop climate change, those costs are large, much larger than the climate scientists would like people to believe. This suggests that you should do moderate amounts of mitigation. And most of the people in this field want to do aggressive climate change mitigation. So what we're seeing here is I would call it sort of an accusation to the climate policy world that they're ignoring real analysis, they're ignoring facts, they're kind of ideologically driven to want to attack this problem when economists tell us it's not that big a deal, don't go too fast, you'll waste money. The bottom line for them is if you spend a few dollars now on mitigation to try to save a few more dollars of GDP 50 or 100 years from now, it's just not a good deal. It's not a good investment of society's resources. So that's the chasm. As I tried to sort through this in my own work, I'll jump to Lee's charge to the panel. How did GSPP equip me to sort through these highly competing arguments made by very smart people on both sides? A couple of things I took away that I have been my touchstones is keep a careful eye out for normative versus positive analysis. Second, don't be intimidated by models. Look under the hood, ask questions, grasp the basics. If a modeler can't tell you, maybe it's not a 5-minute taxi cab ride, but if he can't tell you, he or she can't tell you in 10 minutes, the basic thrust of the model, the main drivers, you probably want to move on. Third concept, use benefit cost analysis as a tool to throw light on issues. Use it to organize vast amounts of information that are going to come streaming in on a complex problem. Beware of using benefit cost analysis as a decision-making tool. Good decisions are going to draw on more than one discipline. And that's the power of GSPP, is giving us interdisciplinary thinking, knowledge, and approaches to problems. Finally, bottom line, we're not here maximizing dollars. We're maximizing utils. Remember that wonderful concept? That kind of thing we can't quite grasp, and we sometimes try to proxy by dollars. But let's not forget, it's well-being, it's satisfaction, it's not just dollars of GDP, which only serve as a rough proxy in some cases. So, is benefit cost analysis a good guide to decision-making on this problem? I put it to you that climate is one big, hairy, ornery, unbounded, ugly problem that doesn't fit in this box very well. I was at a workshop last November on these issues, and famous Harvard professor, sorry I can't quote a Berkeley professor, Michael Hanneman was there on audio talking about agriculture, but this was a Harvard professor. Murray Weisbaum just said, this is the problem from hell. And it really is, for some of the reasons that Lee and Reed have already described. So why is it so hard? One reason is if you're not in the market, you don't count in the benefit cost analysis. One of the lines up here is the impacts on subsistence farmers and fishermen. They don't get in the GDP calculations. The integrated assessment models count the impacts on them as 0. How many of them are out there? I actually tried to find this factoid, and I welcome anybody who might know a sense. Subsistence farmers and fishers have to number at least in the hundreds of millions on this planet. There's 2.5 billion people engaged in agriculture. I found that factoid. How many of them are subsistence farmers? There's a lot, and they're going to be for many decades ahead. We're not all going to embrace industrialized farming, next year. Other major non-quantifiables that aren't in the market: species loss, ecosystem services, the conflicts we could very easily see over food, water, human migration, all the things that drive, all the security concerns that drive Pentagon spending. Those kind of security, conflict things, they don't enter into these models at all. What about the things that we do feel we kind of have a handle on, we could estimate, maybe we could monetize them? Huge uncertainties swamp the modeling efforts, especially when we try to extrapolate to high temperatures. You saw the variation of orders of magnitude just in those 3 models as they try to calculate the social cost of carbon. If your models are differing by an order of magnitude, do you really have a handle on this at all? I would like to ask. Also, a lot of these models assume low cost or no cost adaptation to these impacts. Don't worry, industrialized countries will adapt to this impact at no cost. Developing countries, you're going to incur some costs. That kind of this just sweeps costs under the rug in my view. And another aspect, some of these risks, some of these impacts are really catastrophic. They're not certain, but we can attach non-trivial probabilities to collapse of ice sheets and to increased hydrological cycles that beat down crops with heavy rain, starve crops of rain in other areas. These catastrophic risks should put us in a risk-averse mode. Very, very key concept. Is society risk neutral? risk-averse or risk-preferent to some of the impacts of climate change? I would argue that we should be risk-averse, just like we are in our personal lives. We buy insurance, just as society is in its actions. All of these models take a risk-neutral approach to the calculation of the social cost of carbon. That's not how individuals or societies behave. There are huge intergenerational impacts here that are not part of a normal problem. But discounting of future monetized benefits reduce those impacts to trivial amounts. When you have an impact 100, 150 years in the future, it shrinks to almost nothing with, say, a 3% discount rate, which is what's typically used in these areas. In 2006, some of you may have heard of the Stern report on climate change put out by the United Kingdom. He took an innovative approach of discounting much more lightly in the distant years. He was pilloried by the mainstream economics community for not using a constant discount rate, sort of in the 3% range or better. The interagency group report that I mentioned used 3% as kind of the central value, and yet they sensitivity analysis that would go down to 2 or 1% discount rate would show that it's just skyrocketing social cost of carbon. You also have the rich-poor intra-generational equity impacts. Developing countries are going to suffer a lot more. Poor within countries are going to suffer a lot more. There is no equity weighting of these impacts. $1 to a rich person is the same as $1 to a poor person. That just bursts, in my view, the boundaries of good benefit cost analysis. So my final step in the fourfold path, to steal one more minute, you know, what's the problem? What might help? Would it really work? What's my story? I spent some time thinking about what's my story and what's the story of the mainstream economists. And I think there's a lot of important sort of lower brain assumptions going on here that are not out on the table. One is just the view of the natural world. Is it a foundation of life? Is it a foundation of our economic activity? Or is it just sort of a sector that, just like you got the auto sector, you got the ag sector, you got the environmental sector that we get some benefits from. It's kind of nice to look at whales. It's kind of nice to have trees around. That drives, I think, some of the thinking at a very primitive level. And then finally, there's sort of a view of human technological progress and adaptability. If you think that humans are endlessly adaptable, will always be wealthier, will always come up with great technology to solve any problem, you're probably going to be more likely to say, let's focus on the near-term problems. Well, we're going to have to let future generations deal with those problems. If you're less sanguine about that, you probably want to take more of a risk management, risk-averse approach to this. So I've gone over my time and look forward to discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. And now we're going to hear from Ned Helm, the president and founder of the Center for Clean Air Policy. And Ned is going to tell us about cement, and in particular, Mexican cement.
Now, I promise you, I won't bore you with cement in the kind of detail you might suspect. This is simply an example of a broader set of questions. So I'm going to zoom out from cement before you ever get into that cement kiln and look at this in a much broader context. But I'd suggest... All right. Concrete's made in a different plant than cement. I'd suggest everybody stretch a little bit. You know, we're in that dead zone. Lee said I was a great facilitator. I know from experience, if you're in the group after lunch, everybody kind of gets that low, and you sort of have to lift up a little bit. So everybody stretch a little bit, and I'll try to make this exciting and interesting. What I'm going to do is step back from that detailed example. My colleagues have talked about some detailed examples, and look at this from a broader perspective of policymaking. My organization is a think tank, but we're sort of a think tank with an attitude. So we work a lot with governments. We work a lot with developing countries. We work with the U.S. Reed alluded to the fact I've been a lobbyist. At times I've been a registered lobbyist and worked the Congress in detail on the acid rain amendments, a little less so in last year's debacle. But been in many different places and worked with many different players. We pride ourselves as an organization as being, well, we're very small, 25 people. We are in every market. We play in the EU. We have an office in Brussels. We play in China. We play in Indonesia. We play in India. Play in Brazil. Play a lot in Latin America. We've played here with Chuck in recent years a bit in California. So we try to have a foot in all those markets, working with the governments, the players who are trying to move policy. Our mission is really move policy in a pragmatic, cost-effective way. We believe a lot in emissions trading, though it's gotten a bad name in the last year or so, but I think it'll come back. But our sense is that the economics drive this, and Lee was my mentor. I came here, unlike many of my colleagues, students, I had spent 5 years on the Hill. I'd been working for a congressman who was a 100% liberal guy from West Virginia, big environmentalist, wanted to abolish coal strip mining, and I worked hard on that whole citizens' effort to do that. So I came here as a real advocate, ideological person. I knew I needed to learn more economics, didn't know much economics, and Lee really opened my eyes, and Aaron Wildowski browbeat me in lots of good fights, and I'll talk more about that tonight when I give my remarks at the dinner tonight. But basically, I learned the importance of costs and the importance of understanding the interests of all the players at the table in terms of shaping policies. I couldn't understand why we weren't winning. We were on the side of God and right and moral, whatever, not turpitude, moral, the good guy's side of things, and we weren't winning. You know, we weren't getting the legislation. President Ford vetoed my first big coal strip mining bill. So I'd been through that, and coming here, the light went on. I saw the game differently. I began to understand that there's a reason there were only 8 members of that Energy and Commerce Committee Reid talked about out of 44 who gave a damn about the environment. The rest of them cared about their districts and their self-interest and their district's interest, and if I could craft a package legislatively that appealed to their interest, I could get their votes. So I could get some of the most conservative members of the Senate to support the acid rain legislation we put through, and that's the only way we got it through, and that's the secret of moving something legislative, and it's a secret I learned from GSPP about thinking about those interests. So let me now zoom in to the climate issue. The problem we dealt with was we had a treaty, this is over the last 5 years, okay, and we had a treaty at Kyoto, which basically, you probably heard about the Kyoto Protocol, basically set requirements for the 32 OECD developed nations to make significant reductions, and it basically let all of the developing countries off. It basically said, if you're a developing country and you produce a project like a windmill that replaces a coal plant, you create some carbon credits and you can sell those in the market in the clean development mechanism and get paid for it. Basically, the only reductions you have to make are things that other people will pay for, and those are reductions that don't count for your country, they count for the United States or Europe or somebody else in meeting their targets. So basically, Europe finances that windmill in China, they get those carbon credits, and a plant in Europe doesn't need to make as many reductions. So in terms of the story, we've got the game was very unbalanced. It was very little required of developing countries, and yet here we were at a point where the experts, as Reid and Carl showed, you know, we want to keep the reduction, the temperature increase to 2 degrees centigrade. That means we need about a 50% reduction in 1990 levels globally by 2050. You look at the emissions from the Annex I countries, the OECD, the 32 developed countries. If you zeroed all of us to no emissions at all of carbon, we could not get to that 50% goal because of the growth in developing country emissions. So the story is you can't get there from here without getting developing countries to take reductions on their own, on their balance sheet, not as being paid for to help the US meet its target or to help Europe meet its target. So that was a problem we faced 5 years ago. We're saying, all right, Kyoto Protocol is nice, but we've got to change this. We've got to come up with a system that's going to encourage developing countries to take real actions to reduce their emissions. So that was the issue I was faced with. The other issue I was faced with was competitiveness. Here in the United States, our cement, our steel, our aluminum, our oil refining industries all are saying, wait a second, you regulate us and they steal our jobs. Pollution is going to happen over there, pollution havens in China. Everybody's going to go there. We're going to lose jobs, 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 as Lee said, Governor Granholm. So we knew that was our challenge. And same way when you go and talk to China and Brazil and so on, they're saying, we want to compete. We want to grab this market. We don't want to put new controls on us and make us less competitive. So you have the classic tragedy of the commons that Lee was alluding to, this global good that's out in the future, and the fact that, bottom line, everybody wants to protect their industries. You know, even here in the U.S., Steel, cement, aluminum refining, it's only 8% of GDP. But those guys are incredibly powerful in Congress. And so you've got to take care of them. You've got to find a solution that either gets China and India and so on to make reductions comparable so they can't make this competitiveness argument, or you got to give them a pass, one or the other. But you got to do something here. So here I've got a solution, a problem where I'm trying to figure out how do I get developing countries to act, and how do I also handle this competitiveness problem back home? How do I keep these industries from going to the Senate and killing the bill? Okay, so that's the dilemma I faced and we faced as an organization in going into this debate. And we needed to create incentives for developing countries. We needed to get them educated about what this problem was and get them to see why it was in their interest to act and what new incentives, financial and otherwise, could I offer them that would make it attractive for them to do something without ticking off the cement, the steel, the aluminum, all saying, whoa, wait a second, these incentives are just, you know, subsidies to our competitors. We can't have that. So that's the dilemma. That's the policy problem we face. And I told you sort of where we stood as an organization. We're sort of in between. We work in these countries. We're trusted by these countries. Lee mentioned I was a facilitator. For the last dozen years, we've brought the key negotiators from the top 30 countries together for private, off-the-record negotiations, kind of like a shadow process to the official UN process, where everybody pounds the table and puts their official hat on and gives their official rhetoric and doesn't really talk to each other. We had a backstage process where these guys could talk to each other, where we could use analysis, show them the numbers, do the numbers for China, for India, look at those numbers and have that as a basis for them to understand what the implications were and what the choices were, so that everybody in the room could begin to think about second choices. Nobody's getting their first choice. We got to have a balanced package that makes sense. So as a first step, we got the key developing countries, South Africa, China, Argentina, India, and so on, together. We said, what kind of package could we put together that you guys could live with? And we zeroed in on these energy-intensive, competitive industries. We said, all right, this is where the problem is. If I can take this steel, cement, aluminum thing off the table, I can get this done. It's a lot easier to do something that affects electricity and commercial energy use and home energy use and that sort of stuff than it is these big guys who have big campaign contributions and big ability to affect what happens in the Senate. So that was our goal, and we worked just with the developing countries first. We came up with a strategy, a sectoral approach, where each country would act in these particular sectors. They'd look at the numbers, they'd look at the cost curve, great GSPP kind of thing. What's the cost? What are the options? Some of them are net negative costs, some of them are slightly positive, some of them are more expensive. So we got a supply curve of costs. We say, all right, the cheap stuff, you should do yourself. You agree with that? Right, you'll do those things yourself. The ones that are a little more expensive, let's have some incentive financing from the developed nations, not to buy carbon credits, just financing to help you finance. In my cement example, you'll see to finance the new ways of using different fuels for blending cement, that sort of thing. Let's give them something that allows them to finance those things. They got to pay a big piece. They make their part of the reduction, and those reductions stay in their balance sheet. And back to my original purpose. My original purpose, remember, I want to get a 50% reduction. I can't get there if everything is offsets, if everything is being transferred back to the US or Europe. So I want those net reductions. So I do it with this new thing called NAMAs, Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Actions, in these sectors. That's the basic concept I want. And I get these countries to agree. So we got these developing countries to agree. They said, all right, we'll put this on the table. We'll go to Bali and we'll say, all right, we will take actions if you guys will provide technology, capacity, and financing support, not the full cost, but a portion of this to help us get there, because we know we need the help, we know we don't have the data and all that sort of thing. In return, we get the money from you guys, and it scores on our balance sheet, and we'll monitor, report, and verify what we've done, so you'll know it's transparent, and we want to monitor, report, and verify that you developed countries have actually sent the money. Because this treaty is 17 years of empty promises. Every version of the treaty says, lots of money for all your incremental costs, all your problems. Until last year, we had 17 years, $3 billion is all it was put forward. Now in this next 3, we've got $30 billion, 10 times as much available for this set of NAMAs, for this set of actions by developing countries. So very promising opportunity to go forward. And now we've got to sort of prove it on the ground and show what's possible in terms of action. So this is different, remember, than my CDM, where it was all offsets. This is now real reductions that scores on your balance sheet in these key sectors that we're worried about. Okay, so that's what we're after as a solution. So we got the developing countries on board. You remember the famous TV where Jim Connaughton from the White House is blocking it all till the very end, and the guy gets up from Papua New Guinea and says, you know, either show leadership or get out of the way, and it was on CNN and everything else. And amazingly, the Bush administration caved. They signed the Bali Action Plan, and so we had an agreement. And that was 2007, and we led up to Copenhagen, and we had all this hope. We had 100 presidents, you know, only 190 countries in the world. 100 of the presidents were there. We thought we'd get the deal, and the Danes botched it completely, just you know, the prime minister took over the negotiation. We didn't know anything and made a complete hash of the whole thing. And Obama actually rescued it. I give him credit. I don't give him much credit for last year. You know, he was AWOL when we needed him in terms of the heavy lifting at the end of the game in the Senate. But when it came to the international negotiations, he was amazing. He got China, Brazil, India, and I forget who's the fourth, Indonesia in the room, South Africa. And he cut the deal. You know, when it was all falling apart, he brought his little piece of paper and he sat down with the Chinese. They were at the former meeting. He says, "Can I come in?" They said, "Yeah, I guess so. Why not?" So he came in and he cut the deal. It was unbelievable. He got the deal and they signed the accord, and then he announced it to the press, and he hit on a plane and headed for Washington, and it all fell apart because he hadn't done it through the diplomatic channels. He got all the press. He pissed off the Europeans, pissed off everybody else, and so it kind of dissipated, fell apart. We put it back together last December in Cancun, so we're back on track, we're back and moving, but we lost a valuable year. But nonetheless, we made some good progress. So, bottom line, okay, I've showed you the picture of where we wanted to go. Now we got to prove it. Now we're at a point where there's $30 billion on the table, and is this going to produce reductions? Are these developing countries really going to do something or not? And so our job now is we're working in Mexico in the cement industry, this boring cement industry, and we're saying, all right, let's take a real sector, let's see if we can produce a NAMA, a policy reduction that's going to be financed in part by Annex 1 countries to show this idea works. CCAP did this, we did this back in 1995. We did the very first joint implementation CDM project. No one had ever done it. We got 3 American companies to put the money into changing a Czech Republic heating plant from coal to natural gas to efficiency. And it was a real kick the tires example, you know, great thing, lowered air pollution, kids not going to the hospital, money from the US to do this. Very nice story, and that's exactly what you need. And that's my sense of now where we are today. We need a kick the tires, real world example. So we're in the boring industry of cement, and we're looking in Mexico, and we're trying to figure out, can we produce a good example of what a NAMA is so we can move this ball down the field. So in terms of what that is, I can give you some of the details. Very interesting. I mean, you get into the details, and what do you find out? You know, the story in the United States is, we shouldn't do anything because China's not doing anything. We shouldn't do anything because they have these pollution havens. Actually, we did an in-depth study in China, Brazil, and Mexico. In fact, they're much more efficient in production of cement and in production of aluminum and production of oil and oil refineries than we are. And you probably say, wait a second, the United States? No, we got old capacity. We haven't invested in it for years. We haven't regulated it. You know, Reed said, you know, we've been collecting data on electricity. We haven't touched these guys. They've been exempt from lots of things for many years, and they just aren't very efficient. And they're basically looking for protectionist kinds of things. So that's the history. So here I am digging into Mexico. What do I find out? Every one of their cement kilns is state-of-the-art dry kiln, highly efficient, no opportunity for energy efficiency savings, basically good stuff. And we found a couple of places. We found blending the cement with slag steel and with fly ash could reduce carbon emissions dramatically. Taking them off of petroleum coke and coal and having them burn shredded tires and burn dried sewage sludge and burn treated solid waste would cut their emissions again further. So 2 attractive options. Looks fairly straightforward. So you thought, you know, policy analysts say, okay, easy enough, regulate. Simply set a standard. You must blend your cement to 68% non-clinker in the cement. Well, you sit down with it. We were asked by the government of Mexico, said, sit down with the cement industry, negotiate this deal. We don't want to be at the table. You talk to them, you work with them, you come back when you've got something, we'll talk about it, because they don't trust us, okay? So we sat down with them. Looks simple enough. This is something they liked. Then we get to, well, okay, now we're going to regulate you. They said, no. Well, why not? Well, because our customers won't buy this blended cement. It takes a day for blended cement to set, and Portland cement dries in an hour. So they don't want anything to do with this crap. The only way we can do this is if you create some incentives within Mexico. So we went back to the Mexican government and said, what can we do? Well, we got a green mortgage program. So Mexico says, all right, all green mortgages have to use blended cement. Next thing they said, all right, more than half The construction in Mexico is funded through the federal budget because all the state money comes from the feds, not like here. And we'll say that every construction project, except where there's earthquake risk or something, must use blended cement. So here we got two ways to create the demand, to create the market. At that point, the cement industry says, you don't have to pay us anything. This saves us money. We're on board. We'll go for it. This is a great solution. So that's the first half of our NAMA. Second part was this solid waste and tires and so on. Very interesting. Kind of boring sometimes, but interesting opportunity. Great story, right? Instead of all this sewage sludge dumped on the land, instead of all these illegal landfills, 2/3 of the dumps in Mexico are illegal. Suddenly, I'm collecting this stuff. I got a way to go, and I'm getting an environmental win-win. How can I make that go? What's the problem with that one? Well, the problem with that one is mayors have 3-year terms. City councils have 3-year term limits. They can't sign a contract for more than 3 years. You get the contract for 3 years, the poor cement kiln operator builds the shredder, he builds the treatment facility, all the rest of it, and the new mayor comes in and says, oh, we were paying you to take this waste? I see you got these facilities, why don't you pay me? I don't really like this deal, And they said to me, look, corruption, are you kidding me? These mayors are gonna stick us up. We gotta have something that helps us. So again, we had to go back to the government and say, all right, what can we do? What leverage do we have to overcome this? And we found it through an infrastructure bank and some other ways of caveating the piece and putting it together with good contracts. But that's the kind of stuff when you talk about the analysis. And a nice example, same time, McKinsey, the big consulting firm, had been brought in by ClimateWorks, the big foundation here in San Francisco. They funded McKinsey, do the analysis. They looked at this, oh, it's too cheap to meter. It's so good. There's no reason you need to do any involvement here. This is a winner. Well, of course, they hadn't asked any of the questions that we learned GSPP to ask. Get down there on the ground, figure out, does this really work or doesn't it, and make it work, and put it together so it works. So a good example, again, the key here, zoom back out to my 50,000 feet level, I need real examples. I need to prove this works on the ground. And more importantly, this is a way to get the government in Mexico, the industry in Mexico, you put the carrot of this little bit of money, and they come to the table, they do the supply curves, they get the analysis, and they suddenly understand there's some win-win here, there's some other opportunities here. This suddenly looks much more attractive, and you get them on your side. Just like Reed in the trading program, we got those mid-level managers and all those utilities looking at SO2 and NOx and figuring out where they could trade and could they make some money, and suddenly they were in it. And that's what you need. You need to bring these folks in, educate them, build their capacity, and then they run with it, and then you get more reductions. It's not just about the money, it's about educating people so they see it, and then they become advocates. They say, oh, climate change is important. Now I understand why I'm doing this. And suddenly they're on your side, and you're now making a difference in the policy. So it's a different model than our classic policy analysis, but it's certainly all the tools we learned here are critical. Those supply curves are critical. The questions we were taught to ask about the politics, where are we? What's the politics here? What's the barrier? It's not just the economics. What's the barrier? Why isn't this happening? Looks like a no-brainer. Well, you got to play with the gears to figure out how that thing works together, and it's a daunting task. And I think for us, and as I think about this, one of the guys at lunch was saying, well, I don't see why GSPP is training all these people to do environment. It's not going to be much work. It's not wrong. The developing world is a huge market, a huge opportunity. These people are hungry for the kind of things we do here. If we train them, we transfer this technology and these ideas, we can really make a difference. And this problem is a 50-year problem. This is not, Reed and I were talking at the beginning beforehand, this is a marathon race. Yeah, we've hit an uphill. In the US, we've hit a real uphill. We're not in an uphill in the developing world. We're still able, they're interested. There's, the value of the Copenhagen deal was all those presidents came and they signed up and they said, we're going to do something about climate. Here's our target for Chile. Here's our target for Argentina. Here's our target for China. And even though we've waffled and we've fallen by the wayside to some degree, these guys have said it publicly. And so they're on the line to do this. So the developing countries, we're at a great opening point to really move this game. So I'm much more optimistic. If I just look at the US, I get kind of discouraged. But if I look at this more broadly, I say, no, we're just the laggards. We're the debtor nation. We'll have to catch up later, but let's keep this going. And these actions by developing countries is what we can take back to the Senate, and this crap about China's not doing anything, we're not going to do anything. Say, hey, wrong. Everybody else is doing something. And these guys have more efficient industries than we do, because we're still in a dark age. We're not modernizing. We're just protecting. What kind of strategy is that for the future of America? So I see some hope here, and I see some skills, and I would say, from the GSPP side, There's a huge opportunity here, and I'm glad Lee was telling me at lunch that we're now bringing in, through Blas Perez's program, people from these other developing countries into this program. Really important. There's a huge opportunity here, and we need to grab it. So thank you. I'll stop there.
And now our final story will be from Chuck Schulock on the role of electric drive in reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Thanks, Lee, and I'll just stay here. And very brief primer, by electric drive, I'm talking about cars with plugs. So, you know, a Prius has an electric motor in it, but these are cars that you plug in or a fuel cell, so where some portion of the energy comes from something other than gasoline or diesel. Lee mentioned that I managed the startup of AB 32, the climate program. Before that, I worked on vehicle policy at the Air Resources Board, several different rulemakings, something called the Zero Emission Vehicle Program, and then a rulemaking on greenhouse gas emissions from passenger vehicles. I actually, if you watch the movie Who Killed the Electric Car, you can see the light glinting off the top of my head at the staff table in some of those scenes there. So this goes back a ways. And the other thing that brought back an unhappy memory when Lee is saying, when you mentioned it's a global public good, and we were sued by the automakers on our greenhouse gas standards, and I was deposed, and I remember the question, so Mr. Schulock, if this rule is adopted, will the global temperature drop by 1 degree? No. Half a degree? A tenth of a degree? A hundredth of a degree? And it's all on video and kind of uncomfortable, but you go forward. As far as what's at stake, or why worry about this issue, certainly transportation emissions are a big chunk of emissions globally. Within California, even larger than that. And there's the energy security issue, getting away from Mideast oil. This is a big deal for China. You may be aware that China has a big push on electrification for a couple of reasons. They think they can leapfrog. They're kind of behind on conventional vehicle technology, so they want to, but they have a lot of skills on batteries, and so they want to leapfrog that. So, and so then that leads, there's an industrial policy dimension. I think automakers and governments worldwide are very concerned about falling behind the next generation of vehicle design. And so there's just a lot of interest and effort being put into supporting vehicle electrification, not really for emission reasons, but for industrial policy reasons. And then there's a lot of political prestige on the line. Certainly President Obama has put himself out with some pretty ambitious goals. The same thing happens in other places. So there's, there's a lot at stake there. I mentioned I manage these rulemakings at the Air Resources Board. I'm now a consultant for a sort of a global support group for regulators called the International Council on Clean Transportation that is a nonprofit that provides, depending on the issue or the country, it provides technical support, analytical support to regulators, trying to, in general, raise the bar and level the playing field globally on these issues. So this whole issue of vehicle electrification is a complicated one and a very interesting one from a GSPP type perspective. I mean, the first order questions are, does it make sense to subsidize this, to encourage this, to have policies that would push on it, and if so, well, how much? How much is enough? When do you stop? When do you declare victory? So there's just this whole. The starting point is really trying to figure out even an approach to the issue. Then there's other aspects that come up. These vehicles, electricity comes from someplace, and typically a power plant, and so you have emissions from the power plant. You need to pay attention to that. Who's accountable for that? Typical vehicle standards don't take that into account. So, and Lee's done a lot of good work on various issues associated with electricity as it relates to transportation. There's a whole set of issues there. So there's a lot of interesting policy questions. As far as GSPP and sort of the skills that I was taught that help chip away at these issues. When I sat down and thought about it, there were a lot of them. And I think the first one, maybe at the broadest level, is what I'd call sort of the policy analyst view of the world. And I think people have talked about this in various ways already today, the kinds of questions that you ask or the perspectives that you bring to bear. The Air Resources Board is fundamentally an engineering, scientific, and sprinklings of legal organizations. So, engineers, scientists, and a few lawyers. And very, very good at what they do, world-class experts at what they do, and actually quite good at implementation. So a lot of these implementation issues that are a big deal, I think, thinking through policies, they actually tended to handle pretty well, but not a lot of economics expertise and not much that you would call, policy. And one of the reasons, and this is something that I tried to work on with zero success, kind of on the side during my career, there's not even a position classification in state government called policy analyst. I think this is not true at the federal level, I don't think. My sense is that you'll find a lot more people called policy analysts or with that skill set sprinkled around federal agencies. It's actually pretty rare at the state level, and in general, people need to be creative to figure out a way to hire you. I won't go into it, but the Air Resources Board decided 2 different times that they wanted to hire me, and bless their admin folks who figured out a way to do it, because it was not straightforward. And economics and economic analysis was pretty much viewed as a hoop to jump through or a vulnerability or threat, rather than a source of insight as to, well, what makes good policy here. And so I think just coming in to that kind of organization with the way that we were taught, or I was taught to think here, really did provide some perspectives that were different and I think useful for the organization. And that leads into, well, some of these typical GSPP questions. And I think you alluded to this a little bit, the kind of, well, if this is such a good idea, then how come it's not happening? What's at work here? I mean, I can't think of how many times I talked about that in the course of it. Unintended consequences. A couple of examples that came up in the vehicle electrification world, something called the rebound effect. So if you make driving more efficient and cheaper, people will drive more. Another one is what was called the fleet turnover effect. So if you raise the price of cars, people aren't going to buy as many new cars, therefore you have more old cars on the road. They are much, much dirtier than the new cars. So if you slow down sales, you actually can have a negative impact on emissions overall. And these issues had come up in various things that were going on, and I was kind of waving my hands. One thing I actually pride myself on is that we put in place some contracts with UC researchers to address these issues and give us some pretty authoritative insight on them, so that when we were attacked, we were able to deal with it. But it took some convincing of the rest of the organization, because people tended to just dismiss it. They said, well, that's baloney. We don't need to, that's just, why even worry about that? So these kinds of questions that we were taught to ask, I think, can really be helpful. Another, and this has been talked about too, but I think it was very important, is just the presentation skills. So being able to put together a 1-page memo or a 2-page memo, because again, people tend to lose sight of how busy the policymakers are, and that they don't have time to read some 10-page thing, or if you give them a 10-page thing, they're not going to read it. And that was kind of pounded into us here, and I think was very, very helpful. The talk to the cabbie lesson. Research skills, and so at least in my work, I didn't do much quantitative analysis. Arithmetic was probably the height of it, but certainly consumed a lot of studies and a lot of economic research and analysis. So the ability to just find things that were on point and understand them and identify gaps in our understanding of the problem or what we were going to have to deal with. So the research skills were important. And then economic analysis. You know, Lee mentioned market failures. So having to always come back to that and say, okay, is there a market failure here? In the vehicle world, there are some. You know, the biggest ones, just environmental externalities that everybody understands. And then there's a lot of research that suggests that consumers undervalue future fuel savings. They want a payback of 18 months or maybe 2 years on an investment in a more efficient car, whereas socially, the car is going to be around for 15 years, 200,000 miles. And so, you know, there are some things there, but trying to think through that. And then, you know, cost-effectiveness analysis, cost-benefit analysis, as was mentioned. And then sort of the interaction of different policies and what happens when you think about the different things that we have in place. And in this vehicle electrification world, you have tailpipe standards, you have something called the low carbon fuel standard, which is affecting the fuel, you have something called the renewable electricity standard, which is pushing wind and solar and that kind of stuff, you have cap and trade. All of these things impinge on what the regulation is actually doing. And so you can't just look at, you know, here's my world, I've adopted some tailpipe standards without thinking through, and this is something I'm working on right now, actually, that, you know, that's pretty interesting. When you begin to think about the emissions from the power plant and how that affects policy when you have a cap and trade program or you don't have a cap and trade program, they work kind of differently. So, you know, there's a lot of interesting issues there. And then another one that I would call just the back of the envelope analysis approach, trying to take a pretty simplified view of what's going on to just scope out. Is what we're seeing here even reasonable, or are we missing something? You know, you talked about models. There's a real tendency in this line of work to have these very, very complicated models, enormously complicated, and sometimes it seems like people feel like, you know, the more complicated you get, then the more accurate you're getting, and I tend to be skeptical of that. But just you know, thinking through, okay, what can we do really quickly? Political analysis, some good examples of that. I'll touch on, you know, state-federal interaction in a second, but one reason why California has been a real leader in vehicle control is that we don't have any manufacturers here. You know, they don't build. We have one assembly plant, but fundamentally, vehicle manufacturers don't have a lot of political clout, and actually, certainly the Democrats in the legislature tended to be angry at them because they had some union plants and they had closed them. And so anyway, you know, that California had a comparative advantage in pushing on this compared to national politics. On the other hand, the dealers were a really big deal because every legislator has a bunch of dealers in his district, and they would come and pound on him. And so we had to pay a lot of attention to dealers in what we were doing. And then the environmental organizations, there's a whole spectrum there that you need to learn to deal with. Roland Wong is not in the audience here, but if you were, you know, like your list of people that actually made things happen, certainly in the transportation world, I would add Roland Wong to that short list. He's done a lot of great work, but you know, there's a whole set of the NGOs. And then one interesting political thing that's evolving now is really the state-federal relationship. The traditional role has been that California was sort of like a laboratory. We're the only state that has the ability to adopt passenger standards as a state. Other states can adopt California standards. So there's really two cars. There's a California car, a federal car. And that's how it's been for a long time. And as I said, you know, California had the ability to be more aggressive politically, but most recently, under the Obama administration, there was an agreement reached for national standards that reflected in large part the California standards. And this has tremendous environmental benefit because you're getting every car in the country as opposed to just maybe about a third of the cars that have the California program. So there's a huge upside to that. On the other hand, working, and I'm not doing it now, but when I talk to people, you know, working as the Air Resources Board, where now you're working with the US EPA and NHTSA, and trying to move forward with a unified national program just imposes a lot of constraints and some really, really important political issues that come up. So, but anyway, as a GSPP skill, as you were, Ned was saying, mapping out that political environment was really important. Implementation issues, as I mentioned, I think people tended to be pretty strong on that, but there's still in this electric vehicle world, the structure and the operation of incentives, infrastructure to charge the vehicles, and can you get that in place? So there are certainly implementation skills. So there's a whole set of things that from my standpoint, really, when I sat down and thought about this, it was, oh, wow, there's a lot of stuff here that I really use from the training that I got. To wrap up, in terms of, how could GSPP better prepare the students? One thing that came to mind for me has to do with uncertainty. And if I think about again, this electrification world, there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the climate world broadly, because you're worried about 2050. So what's a battery going to cost in 2020? What's a car going to cost in 2030? What's the price of fuel going to be in 2035? What are we going to be driving? What's the emission profile going to be? So there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and I'm not even quite sure how to articulate this, but just some structured way to think that through would be very helpful for me in what I'm now doing. And it strikes me that it's probably not that unusual to have policy problems that have a lot of uncertainty associated with them. And maybe there are courses that address that now. I don't know, but that came to me as something where I think it would have been really helpful. And then one other thing, and I'm not even really sure if this is a GSPP mission or not, but it's important, and that's really project management skills. When I think about what I did for the last 10 years anyway at the Air Resources Board, and talking to fellow alumni and what they do, in a lot of ways, it is basically project management. You're trying to deliver a regulation or a report or a study or a budget, I suppose. You're trying to deliver something, and you need to figure, and you've got a lot of different people involved, and you need to figure out what can go wrong along the way, and what are the timelines. All those project management skills. And the reason I hesitate is, maybe that's on the job training, or there's other ways to provide that other than GSPP. It's not obvious to me that GSPP or something like this is the best place to do that, but it is very apparent to me that some training of that type, or an introduction to those challenges would be very helpful to alumni as we go out there into the world and get into the management sort of positions. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you so much, Chuck. And thank you, audience, for being so patient. We're going to take your questions for just a few minutes, and then we'll wrap up the session. But what are your questions, reactions, comments? Yeah.
And the rest of what's going on in the electrification efforts. In an instance that harkens back to a couple of adages like either lead, follow, or get out of the way, the Department of Energy you know, was all excited about the possibility of electric cars and put out a couple of very large grants to folks including Tesla and Ford, and has a pot of money that's still sitting there for other grants and is sitting on its hands. And the net result is that there are other car companies out there with new technologies. I've been working with one down in Southern California called Aptera. And they cannot move forward because the Department of Energy won't move forward, and private investment money is sitting there going, well, until the government decides where to place its bets, we're not going to bet either. How do you get around that? How do you get this to move forward when everybody's saying, oh, this is a great idea, here's the money, but you can't have it?
I guess my short answer is I can't really shed much light on that for you. I mean, I'm not, you know, perhaps, I don't know if Reed or other folks that have worked more at the federal level would have something to say, but yeah, I don't, based on my own experience, I don't really have an answer for you. We don't run, you know, large grant things like that at the state level.
We're not really a large technology development organization, and the Department of Energy is. We tend to be more technology agnostic and set performance standards and rely on industry to kind of meet those standards, and other parts of the government are more in the business of you know, subsidizing basic research or applied research. So I don't have personal experience in that problem.
Henry?
Yeah, I was struck by what Carl said. I was struck by what Carl said about the issue of cost-benefit analysis versus risk management. And I was trying to think of some other areas in which risk management might be the approach and not cost-benefit analysis. And one of them, two of them that occurred to me, one was national defense, where I think we typically take a risk management approach. Another one might be epidemic diseases. And in both cases, it seems to me it's because there are systems which are affected out there which we really don't understand very well, and we're not quite sure how they operate, but we know bad things can happen if we let certain other things happen that we're trying to diminish in terms of risk management. Is that the right way to think about the difference between places where cost-benefit analysis makes a lot of sense and where risk management is the right approach? And by the way, this ties into Chuck's point too about the whole question of uncertainty, because the other characteristic of all those fields is the tremendous amount of uncertainty that we have.
Yeah, I think those are two great examples, and I also have taken some of my thinking sort of in a parallel sense. When we deal with severe intergenerational problems, I don't think that empirically governments or individuals take a benefit cost approach, meaning we try to store nuclear waste safely almost forever. We don't discount. We don't find sort of the optimal length of time for a storage cask to last. Is it 100 or 130 years before it all, you know, leaks into the environment? Similarly, we don't try. I think governments try to preserve fisheries, preserve forests, preserve soil, you know, on a sustainable harvest, sustainable yield kind of basis. We don't do a benefit cost exercise to say, what's the optimal degradation we should do to this fishery? Now, in practice, we often screw it up, let's face it, but at least overtly, the policy goals we adopt as societies try to preserve resources at sort of at least the same level of use for the future. And I think there's some other examples that could be compiled in that range. Did you want to say that?
Thank you. Hi, I'm John McKill, and I'm a second-year student at the Goldman School. I have a question specifically for Carl regarding the kind of cost-benefit methodology and its limitations for climate change. And I personally have been grappling with this quite a bit lately because it's related to my APA project here at the Goldman School. And you know, one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of carbon is, you know, using it in assessing its benefit and kind of deferred benefit of carbon reduction versus, say, other air pollution types, and perhaps doing a sensitivity analysis that goes from like a a positive bound to a zero bound, and then you can basically assess equal benefit. So not completely stepping out of the cost benefit paradigm, but adjusting the discounting rate such that you aren't putting carbon at a disadvantage. And I don't know necessarily if that gets you around the problem, but I think it definitely avoids the issue of intergenerational or intertemporal equity that I think is primary to the issue that you bring to light here. And so, I mean, I think a combination maybe of like a Bayesian probability model and then like a setting of appropriate, more quote unquote appropriate discounting rates for carbon reduction might address the issue, because I don't see how you can just strictly apply a risk model in an issue that inherently has to do with costs and benefits. I mean, because you have to have some assessment of monetary value so you have a common denominator for what you need to spend now to mitigate a problem and what that's going to avoid you in terms of negative risk. So, I mean, it's a portion of my APA, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to address it to the extent that would be necessary, but it is an issue that for me personally is kind of central to the work that I'm doing. So I'd be interested to hear not only Carl's thoughts, but from the rest of the panel as well.
Mm-hmm. I can say I'll be very interested to read your APA when it's done, and I think your comments highlight the fact that the risk just to say we're doing risk management doesn't lead you to precise decisions. One of the beauties of the benefit cost framework is that in theory it helps you make the decision. It says find the optimization point. There's no analog on the risk management side or the precautionary application of the precautionary principle. It's a much more judgmental exercise. And in fact, you know, one of the stones thrown at it, and again, this is a real incident from the workshop last November, is some card-carrying economist said, you know, well, if you take that kind of risk management approach, then, you know, we ought to spend an infinite amount of money to prevent an asteroid from hitting the Earth. You know, there's some chance out there, so why don't we launch, you know, a Star Wars program to be ready for the asteroid? I think that's stretching it a little bit, and yes, you can't spend an infinite amount of money to eliminate every risk. But I like the direction you're thinking in, and I think some of the most insightful economists I've dealt with are trying to sort of blend cost-benefit analysis with risk management thinking and saying how can we blend sort of the best of these paradigms to come up with ways that can really guide decisions on these really thorny problems.
Last question. Oh, sorry.
Another comment?
Weigh in on Carl's point too. I wanted just to agree with the point that he had made in his talk and sort of responding to your question about the challenge of quantifying the benefits, because I was involved in this effort that he described earlier in running these integrated assessment models, and there's a lot that we can't model. We can't do things like ocean acidification, huge part of the problem. And it's also a question of endpoints. You know, one of the challenges with climate change is it's not just where the state of the world is in 2050, but it's how fast we get there and how fast ecosystems can adapt. So humans are very adaptable. We have air conditioning and other sort of means to adapt to changing temperatures, but ecosystems don't. And so if ecosystems change quite rapidly on a decadal scale, you also have to care about the rate of change, not the end state in 2050. And that's another thing that's really challenging to kind of feed into this conventional paradigm. People have tried, you know, well-known folks have done analyses on this question, but again, it's fairly cutting edge. And so making decisions here requires a very interdisciplinary kind of perspective.
I'm going to take one more question before we kind of close the session, but I know that there are more questions, and I believe that most of the panelists would be happy to stay around for a few more minutes and talk with those interested. Michael.
So I think this question's more geared towards Ned and Reed, but one of the projects that I just finished up at the PUC, we did a policymaking via settlement, which is kind of a weird way of doing something, but we got a whole bunch of very interested parties in the room, said, here are your bumper lanes. This is what we will most likely approve, but anywhere in between here, go for it. And we helped broker this over many, many months. And it sounded very similar to what Ned was talking about. So I guess the question I have is, if an ultimate goal is to try and figure out federal climate policy and not different countries and different frameworks, if we're trying to figure out something on the federal level, how do we set the bumper lanes? How do we say, okay, how do we give folks enough cover to be able to negotiate, but who says here's, can't go any higher than this, can't go any lower than this? Who's that person to be able to do that, to actually get the folks to say, all right, navigate in this waters?
My question is, who sets the deadline to stop negotiating? Because it's in some people's interest to keep negotiating.
You can maybe do that within your, let's say you're doing a reg, you've got to issue this regulation by next, this summer, and then you got a year to do it. You could set up a reg-neg process that sets some limitations on it and set some boundaries of what the standard might be, between natural gas and something beyond that, and discuss the costs and so on. I think it could be actually pretty useful. I mean, it's funny, on this whole fight about EPA and the regulations, we work a lot with industry, and privately, even some of the dirtiest coal utilities, the ones you'd expect to be the most resistant, sort of say, well, we'd really like EPA to regulate. In a sense, we'd like some certainty. We got to make these investments, and we're sitting here for years holding up on investments for conventional pollutants because we aren't sure what's going to happen on this climate thing. They can't say that because the right wing is in sway, and they take names and they punish, so they can't. But privately, even Southern and AEP are willing to do this. So I think it could be an interesting path for EPA. I mean, for now, I guess EPA has to lay low because you don't want to lose your authority. But once that fight is won, let's hope we win, then maybe this could be interesting. I don't know your reaction, but I think it could be.
I guess, do you think it's EPA? The fight is at EPA? Do you think is it in Congress? Where?
I think it's at EPA now. I mean, the Plan B is now EPA regulation.
Yeah, but Ned was also illustrating why, because this is a global problem, why we need to focus on addressing the developing country issue in order to solve the domestic problems. Because when we're talking to members of Congress, they will say, I have X plant in my district that's competing overseas, and you need to show me that this is being borne across the world in an equal way. So I think it's challenging in that respect. You have to have a way forward internationally to be able to make progress domestically. It's not that we can't, do good things domestically at the same time, but we have to have, a sort of a path on the international side.
And we, before the bill failed, Reed worked on this as well. We'd negotiate a very clever package for these heavy industries, these energy-intensive industries that would phase out after a certain number of years, and during that time, the developing countries are supposed to step up, and in fact, they already were. And at that point, you could stop the free allowances. We basically give them free allowances for a period to cushion the hit,
That was the thing.
But it's a little harder to do in the regulations.
Yeah, that particular feature was the thing that I spent most of my time on with the Energy and Commerce Committee, was looking at how we could protect particular domestic industries through these free allocations from this foreign competition. Yeah.
Last comment. It struck me. I didn't address what could GSPP do better, but there's one theme here that struck me as I was sitting here. As many of you know, there have been a number of advocates out there in recent years of trying to solve multiple problems at once. A major transition to clean energy. What does that do for us? Let's tackle the climate problem. If we get off of oil, particularly in the transport sector, we reduce our foreign dependency on oil and all the money streaming out. We achieve security benefits. We do more homegrown energy. We produce jobs, et cetera. That creation of a vision and working on multiple fronts to solve multiple problems, I personally find that a compelling vision, and I think a lot. I think that kind of visionary stuff is something that at least was not sort of taught or inspired when I was in policy school. We tend to, divide problems up, break them down, think of changes at the margin, think of, how do we get incentives right to encourage this kind of behavior, which is all good, and in some cases might be the best way to tackle a problem. But when you have huge, long-term, thorny, interrelated problems. Again, sort of the incremental approach doesn't work. The benefit cost analysis approach doesn't work. Again, you have to step outside, and I think you have to paint on a big canvas, think big thoughts, and be visionary. It's really hard to make any of that stuff happen. But that kind of thinking wasn't embedded in the curriculum when I was here, and I don't know where it stands now, but I'll stop with that thought.
We do have a course now that Bob Reich teaches on leadership, where he actually tries to make people think. But certainly with respect to problems, how do you take a leadership role and how do you put together a solution?
I'm going to just take the chair's prerogative to offer a quick response to some of the issues about cost-benefit analysis that have been raised. And my response is to urge everybody to focus on trying to achieve, in the climate change problem, a quantity goal, a quantity reduction goal. Force the debate to be about how much reduction do we want to have by 2020 and how much do we want to have by 2050, and let everything else follow from that. You will get, don't try to set your quantity goal by a cost-benefit analysis that equates marginal benefit with marginal cost. It's way too hard to do that. You'll get a much more sensible conclusion and policy by focusing on quantity. That's the way we did it with SO2 and the acid rain that all you guys have worked on, and that's the same way to do it with greenhouse gas reductions. So try to stay away from, that's another argument for why you want to have a cap and trade approach as opposed to a carbon tax approach. Carbon tax approach, you say, what price is reasonable to pay? Cap and trade approach, you say what quantity reduction is reasonable to achieve, and you'll get a much more reasonable answer on the quantity side. So that would be my advice on that issue. And thank you so much for coming, and thanks to the panelists for all their work.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks to this wonderful panel and the earlier panel, and again, thanks for coming.